Coronavirus: understanding, managing and surviving one of our greatest contemporary challenges, how we respond to emerging threats. The objectives of this presentation are to provide people with a comprehensive overview of the issues that have led to and result from the emergence of new diseases such as COVID-19, to empower individuals and organizations to know how to effectively and sustainably manage and resolve the challenges associated with the increasing occurrence of novel diseases. In this presentation, we will discuss the following topics: emerging diseases such as coronavirus and the issues that these diseases highlight, the potential extent of the challenges faced through emerging diseases, and the importance of the issues to all of us, the consequences of our current approach to try to resolve the challenges of emerging diseases, and an alternative perspective to understand and manage emerging challenges. Before we proceed, it is important to appreciate that complex real-world problems are resolved through understanding of all of the relevant information in correct context. Isolated facts always precede the building of understanding and the resolution of problems, but are shocking when considered in isolation and lack of context of the big picture. However, assembly of all of the relevant information allows any of us to know and understand how to respond effectively, wisely, and calmly to novel challenges. Successful understanding and resolution of real-world challenges is dependent upon the reliability of the information that is used to build the understanding of the challenges in context of the real world. The information within this discussion has been collected from reputable sources such as the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the World Health Organization, Johns Hopkins, Wikipedia, and additional figures have been calculated by simple calculations based upon data from the above sources. The information in this presentation concerning the spread of the coronavirus has been limited to the initial cases for a number of reasons. To successfully resolve challenges, we must see and understand the nature and full scope of the challenge. As the case numbers increase, the figures become less reliable as it becomes more difficult and slower to collect accurate information, as this requires more resources, people, and time. Additionally, the later information shows the effect of our response. Quarantines and lockdowns can limit the spread of pathogens within the short term, but affect what is seen in the data, which makes it difficult to determine the full extent of challenges and future problems. Additionally, quarantines and lockdowns may not be effective at managing pathogen spread in the long run. From our perspective, diseases can be defined as anything that affects the normal functioning of our cells, organs, body, or even society. Diseases can be caused by physical damage or defects to our cells, organs, or body, or more importantly, a failure of our immune systems to prevent other living things to occur in the wrong place and with the wrong function. For instance, viruses, bacteria, worms, and our own cells. It is important to appreciate that the great majority of viruses, bacteria, worms, and cells are benign or have a positive effect on the environment and our health. It is only when any of these entities occur in the wrong place at the wrong time and lead to a loss of function that a disease can develop. Biological diseases have their origin in nature as a consequence of evolution. All species evolve in order to adapt to a changing physical world, and some adaptations may lead certain organisms to promote disease states. It is not necessarily feasible or desirable to change the biodiversity of life in order to remove the threat of diseases, as natural biodiversity results in the clean air that we breathe, the water that we drink, and the food that we eat. However, it is possible to regulate and manage how disease-causing organisms are introduced and spread within human populations. Most disease-causing organisms are introduced and spread into human populations through our lack of awareness of the organisms and our lifestyles. For example, the level of exposure and the extent of exposure to these organisms through population density and frequency of travel and transportation. We can appreciate this through a simple analogy by comparing bacteria and viruses to snakes. In the wild, snakes carry out a beneficial function of regulating the rodent population. As humanity encroaches into the territory of snakes, we can directly experience problems with snakes. Additionally, if we inappropriately dispose of our waste, we can raise the rodent population that leads to the promotion of the snake population, which exacerbates the negative interaction of snakes with humans. Coronavirus is an infectious agent that is new to people. Coronavirus is a virus that is a small and structurally simple particle that consists of genetic information wrapped in a protein coat. Coronavirus can reproduce and spread quickly due to its simple nature and the means of transmission that includes coughing and sneezing. Coronavirus is similar to about 10 to 20% of cold viruses that there are themselves coronaviruses. Coronavirus infects and affects the functioning of lung cells and may cause or lead to the development of pneumonia. COVID-19 is a member of the coronavirus family, which themselves are members of the virus family. Viruses range in size from 1/20th to 1/3 of a micrometer. To put this in perspective, we can compare viruses to a human hair follicle, which themselves range in size. Viruses are between 1/200th and 1/8000th the size of a human hair follicle. Additionally, viruses range in size between 1/100th and 1/5000th the size of a human cell, which themselves range in size considerably. Viruses are between 400,000 and 18 million times smaller than the width or the length of human lungs. Virus particles consist of nucleic acid that is wrapped in a protein coat. The protein coat of viruses allow viruses to bind to the surface of specific cell types. Once a virus binds to a specific cell type, it is internalized into the cell where the protein coat is stripped off and the nucleic acid takes over the running of the cell and forces the cell to make new virus particles. A virally infected cell is capable of making many millions of copies of virus particles, which are then released and combined to additional cells around the infected cell. The specific cell types that viruses are able to bind to determines the tissues or organs that are affected by viruses, which itself determines the specific types of illnesses that viruses confer. For instance, cold viruses typically infect the cell types in the nasal cavity and cause runny eyes and runny noses. Similarly, flu viruses typically infect cell types in the lower respiratory tract and cause coughing and sneezing. COVID-19 differs from cold viruses and flu viruses as it is able to bind to a wide range of cell types in the whole respiratory tract and lungs. The ability of COVID-19 to bind to cell types deep in the lungs, in particular in the alveoli, lead to COVID-19's ability to produce more serious viral infections than colds and flu. On initial infection with COVID-19, people enter an asymptomatic stage where too few cells have become infected to notice symptoms. However, it is possible, even though people don't exhibit symptoms of illness, for people to pass on infection of COVID-19 through coughing and sneezing, even though they are asymptomatic. As the number of cells infected in the lungs increase, people can start to present symptoms of infection with tightness of breathing and coughs and sneezing. As people sneeze and cough, they are able to spread virus particles to others and infect others. Some individuals with COVID-19 infection can go on to develop more serious complications of infection with COVID-19. As more cells become virally affected deep in the lungs, some people can go on to develop pneumonia. Pneumonia is characterized by inflammation and increased mucus secretion in the cells deep in the lungs and can cause problems and complications as it leads to difficulty breathing, lower oxygen concentrations in the blood, and potential death in some people. The specific cell types that COVID-19 is able to bind to and the incredibly long incubation period of COVID-19 infection accounts for the severity of illness that COVID-19 can lead to within individuals and within society. What was factually and reliably known about COVID-19 by the 8th of February? By the 8th of February, it was known that COVID-19 had an incubation period of up to 14 days that could be asymptomatic and potentially infectious. 37,143 cases had been identified and 2,792 recoveries had occurred, which accounted for 7.5% of identified cases. And 813 deaths had occurred, which accounted for 2.1% of identified cases. So with so few cases and deaths, why was there so much concern and coverage of COVID-19? What are the issues and concerns regarding emerging diseases and COVID-19? COVID-19 is a viral infection that is new to humans, is transmitted between people, spreads readily and rapidly, and has a high mortality rate. The central issue with emerging diseases, in particular novel viruses, are that we have no natural individual or social immunity, therefore pathogens can spread more rapidly throughout our bodies and through society, leading to a greater degree of illness within our bodies and society. The increased virulence and pathogenicity of emerging diseases that we do not have natural immunity to leads to a higher mortality rate from these diseases. Natural immunity is vital to our survival as individuals and as a society. Our personal individual immunity that we acquire from birth or that we acquire through exposure to illnesses allows us to limit the spread of pathogens within our body and allows us to clear pathogens more rapidly from our body. Additionally, our personal immunity contributes to social or herd immunity, which allows us to block the spread of pathogens within society or to lower the frequency of exposure and the levels of exposure of pathogens within society. It is important that we understand and respect the true function of our immune systems. For example, people often mistakenly believe that vaccines directly protect them from viruses and bacteria. However, vaccines merely educate our immune systems to recognize viruses and bacteria, and it is our immune systems that ultimately protect us from diseases such as viruses and bacteria. Similarly, people mistakenly believe that antibiotics protect them from bacterial infection, whereas antibiotics only kill a proportion of infecting bacteria within the body, and it is the body's immune system that ultimately returns us to health. The issues and central concerns regarding COVID-19 aren't centered around the absolute numbers. For instance, the number of cases and deaths of COVID-19 observed as of the 8th of February, as these figures are not alarming when compared to the numbers for regular flu. Many millions of people contract regular flu every year and successfully recover. Between 20,000 and 50,000 people die annually from the flu within the US, which represents a mortality rate of 0.1%. Over 1 million people die annually worldwide from the flu, again representing a mortality rate of 0.1%. The central issue and concern regarding COVID-19 and any other emerging disease is the ability of the emerging disease to cause illness and death. This concern is exacerbated with COVID-19 given the rate of spread of COVID-19. COVID-19 can spread 62 times quicker than SARS and 2,900 times quicker than MERS. Additionally, COVID-19 has a very long incubation period of up to 14 days, with the potential to be infectious during an asymptomatic incubation period. To put this into context, we can examine the incubation period of flu and colds, which range from 2 to 4 days. Therefore, people can be infectious with COVID-19 between 2 to 4 times longer than with colds and flu without appreciating it. Another central issue and concern regarding COVID-19 and emerging diseases is the mortality rate. COVID-19's mortality rate has conservatively been estimated at about 2.1%. This figure does not on its own sound alarming unless put into context of regular illnesses. COVID-19 is 20 times more fatal than regular flu, which has a mortality rate of 0.1 to 0.15%. COVID-19's mortality rate is closer to the mortality rate seen for Spanish flu in 1918 that killed between 5 to 10% of the world's population, which at that time accounted for the death of between 50 to 100 million people. It is possible to predict how significant COVID-19 could be as a disease-causing agent by looking at how quickly COVID-19 virus has spread. By plotting out the total number of cases recorded within the first 20 days against time, we can determine how long it takes COVID-19 cases to double. By examining the graph, we can see that the total number of cases doubles approximately every 3 to 4 days. For instance, the total number of cases goes from 5,000 to 10,000 cases in about 3 days, and from 10,000 cases to 20,000 cases in about 4 days. We could assess the worst case scenario for the spread of COVID-19 using the first 20 days case data and extending it using a 3-day doubling time. Based on a 3-day doubling time, everyone on the planet could be exposed to COVID-19 within 25 doublings, 75 days, or as early as the 5th of April 2020. It is unreasonable to assume that any virus would have a 100% infection rate. For instance, flu virus typically has an infection rate of only 25%. However, given the 3 to 4 times increased incubation period of COVID-19, it is not unreasonable to assume that COVID-19 might have a 75% infection rate that could be achieved by the 5th of April. We can also assess the significance of COVID-19 as an emerging disease by examining the change in the number of deaths within the first 20 days of reported cases. Based on an examination of the initial first 20 days of spread of COVID-19, we can see that the number of deaths doubles approximately every 4 to 5 days between the 20th of January and the 8th of February. For example, the number of deaths from COVID-19 doubled from 200 to 400 in a little over 4 days, and the number of deaths doubled from 400 to 800 in just over 5 days. By the 8th of February, COVID-19 had a mortality rate that was predicted in the order of 2.1%. We can evaluate the significance of COVID-19 as a pathogenic disease by looking at the time taken for 2.1% of the world's population to succumb to COVID-19. We can calculate the worst case scenario to achieve a 2.1% global fatality level using our initial case data and extending it using a doubling time of mortality of 4 days. From the graph, we can see that COVID-19 could kill 2.1% of the global population in as early as 22 doublings, 92 days, or by the 25th of April. Our models demonstrate that COVID-19 represents a significant and immediate threat to humanity, both in its rate of spread and its rate of achieving high mortality numbers. How do the contemporary numbers compare to the predicted numbers based upon the doubling times of new cases, recoveries, and mortality? As of the 4th of March, there have been cases reported in 90 countries and over 130 locations. The movement of 700 million people have been restricted within China, which accounts for 9.2% of the global population. 11 cities within China have locked down the population, which encompasses over 100 million people. 95,200 cases of COVID-19 had been identified, which compared to the predicted model of 9,240,576. 53,800 cases of recovery had been documented, 3,460 deaths identified, which compared to our predicted model of 25,600. How can these apparently large discrepancies between our predictive models based on doubling times be reconciled with the actual cases reported? Perhaps the easiest way to explain the discrepancy between the observed numbers and the predictive model is to question the validity of the predictive model, as our doubling time models for new cases, recoveries, and deaths are based solely on a single country's reporting for the first 20 days of detection. We can test the validity of the model by adding in the additional case data subsequent to the 8th of February till to present time. We can visually see the validity of the model by plotting the new case data with the original case data and seeing how the trends align. As the range in the case data varies so wildly, we can use a log scale in order to compress the data to see the trends in the data. By looking at the full range of data available for new cases from China, we can see both the initial doubling time of unrestricted COVID-19 and we can see the effect of lockdowns to slow the rate of new cases. Although the lockdowns slow the rate of new cases considerably, they do not prevent the emergence of new cases totally, which raises the question at what cost has the reduction in new cases been achieved? What are the consequences of locking down huge regions of a country? And can this approach be sustained sufficiently to allow people to recover and become immune to COVID-19? We cannot test our model of COVID-19 using the data from China and the later cases, as these reflect the effects of lockdowns. However, we can compare the initial spread of COVID-19 from China with the spread of COVID-19 across the rest of the world. The knowledge and understanding acquired from the information acquired from the rest of the world's cases can be highly informative, as the information was drawn from many locations with differing strategies and population densities. By looking at the middle range of the data, we can see that the strategies adopted by various countries to slow or halt the spread of COVID-19 appear to have some partial success. However, by looking at the later spread of the disease, we can see that the spread rate, or the instance of new cases, rapidly approaches that of the initial spread rate seen in China, which is approximately a doubling time of 3 to 4 days. Therefore, the information from the rest of the world helps to substantiate our model for the doubling of new cases of COVID-19. To substantiate our doubling rate models, we can look at the recovery rate across the full range of data and see how it changes. As the recovery rate from the Chinese data and the rest of the world appears consistent, this helps to validate the model for the doubling time for new cases, recoveries, and deaths. The doubling rate for recovery from COVID-19 appears to be in the order of 8 to 9 days. The recovery rate is between 2 or 3 times slower than the infection rate or new case rate. As the new case rate exceeds the recovery rate by a significant factor, we can conclude that our approaches and strategies to managing and handling this emerging challenge are either misdirected, insufficient, or ineffective. If our doubling times are calculated from the case data and appear to be correct, how can we explain the discrepancies between the observed number of cases and the predicted number of cases? There are several factors that help to explain discrepancies in the reported case data. Firstly, it is important to realize that solely looking at the changes in the total number of cases can be misleading when trying to assess what is going on with COVID-19, as the China data disproportionately influences observed trends within the data. For instance, by day 20 of the reported data, the China cases accounted for 99% of total cases, and even towards the end of the available data set, China cases account for 66% of total cases. The contribution of the Chinese data and their lockdowns will in part account for the discrepancy between the reported number of cases and the predicted number of cases, as the Chinese data accounts for such a large proportion of the case data. The discrepancies between the predicted and calculated case counts appear to be extremely large. However, these differences can themselves be explained in only 3 to 4 doublings. That is to say, the difference between the observed and predicted number of cases could be explained in discrepancies in recording cases in as little as 14 days. Additionally, the discrepancies between the predicted number of cases and reported number of cases could be explained if the reported cases were incomplete. There are a number of factors that could account for the reported cases being incomplete. Firstly, reported cases are derived from areas of known COVID-19 infection where people test positive for elevated temperatures and are then tested directly for the presence of COVID-19. However, should people not test positive from areas of COVID-19 infection for elevated temperatures, they potentially are missed from the dataset. If as few as 50% of people failed to test positive for temperatures and then went into the general pool, these could account for the discrepancies between the predictive model and the reported numbers of cases in as little as 1 doubling time, should this have occurred early in the progression of COVID-19. Additionally, discrepancies between the predictive model and the reported number of cases could also be explained should there be pools of infected people in areas that are not being currently screened. This idea tends to be supported by data from countries that have screened more widely through their populations than just known infected areas. It is also important to appreciate the potential margin for error in the reported cases. Today's counts of reported cases reflect infections that could have occurred between 7 to 23 days ago, i.e. between 2 to 8 doublings, which could give a margin of error in the reported cases of between 4 to 256-fold differences. The figures that can be calculated from the reported number of cases, recoveries, and deaths paint an alarming picture. The doubling time for new cases is between 3 to 4 days, and for recoveries between 7 to 8 days, which implies between 2 to 3 times more people become infected than can recover in the comparable time period. The discrepancy between the recovery doubling time of 7 to 8 days and the mortality doubling time of 4 to 5 days is alarming and indicates that people may urgently require education to recognize the symptoms of COVID-19 infection and when those symptoms indicate a poor prognosis for recovery to COVID-19, and that people may require careful monitoring and support to guide them through recovery of COVID-19 infection. The changes in the number of cases between the 29th of January and the 12th of March, i.e. the last 43 days, also paints an alarming picture. Within the last 43 days, new cases of COVID-19 have increased by a factor of 16.4-fold. New deaths have increased by a factor of 27.8-fold, and the mortality rate has increased by a factor of 1.7-fold. Taken together, this information indicates that COVID-19 is spreading at an alarming rate and becoming more lethal as it spreads across the world. By understanding the case data, from COVID-19 new cases, recoveries, and mortalities, we can appreciate the strategies that aren't working to manage the spread of COVID-19. By appreciating the strategies that are not working and the philosophies behind those strategies, we can identify strategies that can be effective at managing and coping with this new emergent disease. Perhaps the largest factor that explains our failure to manage the spread of COVID-19 is our philosophy or approach to handling the problem. We are dedicated to trying to stop or contain the unpreventable. History has repeatedly shown that quarantines and lockdowns tend to spread disease and are misdirected. Recent experiences with COVID-19 demonstrate the errors of quarantines. For instance, quarantining people on ships when there isn't a successful way of truly isolating people from cross-spreading diseases leads to the spread of diseases in contained areas and then presents a problem of how to manage those individuals and incorporate them back into society. Historically, when quarantines have been conducted on land, people always fail to adhere to quarantines and then ultimately spread the disease. However, perhaps the largest reason why quarantines can't work is quarantines rely on successfully and absolutely identifying all potential people who have an infection, and this invariably proves to be impossible. Lockdowns invariably also fail for the same reason. For lockdowns to be effective, the lockdowns must identify all regions that have infection and must lock down those regions for sufficient time for the infection to burn itself out within that location. And invariably, lockdowns cannot be maintained or achieved with 100% effectiveness. Lockdowns also pose significant risk to the functioning of society. Given the degree and extent of globalization, lockdowns can damage vital supply chains. We can appreciate the problem of lockdowns for supply chains through an example. If we imagine two regions, one providing food and the other providing water, if either of these regions lock down, both regions are ultimately damaged as they will lose a vital resource. In a global world where countries are more and more interdependent, the negative consequences of lockdowns become even more significant than our simple model. In order to successfully manage and cope with the spread of COVID-19, it is important to direct resources and time to the effective areas. It is necessary, therefore, to question the benefit of certain strategies and approaches. For example, what does testing achieve if our model were correct and up to 2% of the general population were already infected with COVID-19? At this point, would it not be better to ensure that people understand what to expect and how to cope with what to expect? People in society want a technological and quick fix to a problem. However, it is important to question whether these quick fixes actually provide the benefit and the solution to the problems that they are intended for. For example, how effective are hand sanitizers and masks? Recent studies show that neither of these effectively help with the COVID-19 problem. For example, most masks cannot block the transmission of viruses over time and could actually lead to an increase in the infection rate of someone who is rebreathing through a mask. Additionally, hand sanitizers need to be applied for up to 3 minutes to effectively eradicate COVID-19 virus. It is important to question the use of hand sanitizers, as they can also lead to dermatitis and add to the ability of viruses to penetrate the body. At this point, given the realization of the significance of COVID-19 as a disease-causing agent, it is vital that we identify the effective strategies to minimize and slow the spread of COVID-19 in order to allow us to build immunity and to cope with the consequences that will arise from the spread of COVID-19. From our case data and history, we can appreciate that strategies that seek to fully stop the spread of novel diseases ultimately fail, as do strategies that seek to contain the spread of new and emerging diseases. Therefore, we need to develop strategies that manage the spread of diseases to allow us to cope socially and to develop immunity to the emergent disease. Today, perhaps one of the most important things that we could collectively do to minimize the spread of COVID-19 is to stop tourist travel, both international and domestic, and to limit all non-essential travel across distances. Travel across geographical distances spreads the virus and variants of the virus across large geographical regions. In addition, tourist travel ultimately involves extremely high encounter rates of people between people. For instance, when people travel by car, boat, aeroplane, or train, they tend to be in close confinement for extended periods of time and tend to rebreathe air and share air between one another and can cross-infect people readily. Additionally, when people travel for tourist purposes, they tend to meet large numbers of individuals socially for extended periods of time in situations such as restaurants and enclosed spaces, which helps to spread viruses. It is also important to view the transmittance of diseases from tourism from another perspective, that of the staff that are supporting tourism, who come into intimate and repeated contact with members of the public who could be infectious. Therefore, support staff can readily and unknowingly transmit infections to a wide array of people. Ultimately, tourism helps to spread variants of viruses and to increase the viral load in geographical regions, which makes it harder for people to successfully become immune to emerging diseases, and ultimately raises the mortality rate. Another approach we can adopt to minimize the spread rate of COVID-19 is to stop large gatherings. However, this approach is less significant than stopping tourism, as large gatherings tend to be infrequent and the people within large gatherings do not come from such wide geographical regions or encounter such large numbers of people in close proximity for such extended periods of time. In order to successfully manage the consequences and spread of COVID-19, it is important that all members of society actively support society and their local communities, as every member of society can potentially spread and contribute to the spread of COVID-19. Members of society must become learners and teachers and understand the facts associated with COVID-19 and the spread of this virus. For instance, understanding the symptoms of COVID-19, the order of development of symptoms, and when and how to seek help should those symptoms become unmanageable. It is currently unrealistic to believe that we are going to stop COVID-19 spread, and we have to learn how to live with the presence of COVID-19. It is important that people know how to maintain low viral levels within their homes, workspaces, daily lives, and communities in order to minimize the chance of reinfection with new or variant viruses prior to the development of immunity. We can minimize exposure rates by minimizing social contact if we know that we are infected with COVID-19. We can open windows to drop viral loads, and we can minimize exposure to family members if we have COVID-19 and other family members do not. Or alternatively, if all family members have COVID-19, we can minimize encounters with family members during the time taken to recover from infection with COVID-19. Additionally, once people have recovered from infection of COVID-19, those people can help other people to recover, as they potentially contribute to social or herd immunity and represent the people that are most likely to not spread COVID-19. Each one of us can promote our recovery from COVID-19 today by promoting our health today. With respect to promoting our personal health and immune systems, there are many things we can do immediately that can have immediate and positive effect on our health. For instance, if we smoke and stop smoking, we can have immediate benefits from stopping smoking, and those benefits increase over time the longer that we maintain stopping smoking. Additionally, we can promote our immune systems and our health immediately by promoting the consumption of a balanced diet of fruits, vegetables, nuts, and grains, which contain elements that help the immune system to fight off viral infections. Additionally, we can all actively and modestly exercise, which helps to circulate our immune systems. For instance, even modest walking around the block can help our immune systems to recover from an infection. Additionally, ensuring that we receive plenty of sleep and that we reduce stresses in our lives as much as possible helps to promote our immune systems and fight off infections. Our experience with COVID-19 highlights the need for development in 3 core areas. Firstly, the emergence and spread of COVID-19 has highlighted the lack of preparedness of the general public to know how to effectively cope with the emergence of these contemporary threats. As all members of society are able to contribute to the transmission of emerging diseases, it is essential that all members of society are prepared to understand how to mitigate the transmission of these emerging threats. Secondly, the rate at which COVID-19 has been able to spread highlights that we need to make essential changes within our lifestyles. The pace of our lifestyles both can create and spread our problems. For example, mass transport not only allow us to travel across the planet, but also allow us to take with us emerging pathogens and transmit them across the planet inadvertently. Lastly, the emergence of COVID-19 and our responses to emerging threats through lockdowns highlights the sensitivity of our centralized supply chains and excessively long supply chains. The emergence of COVID-19 demonstrates the necessity for local regions to be able to adequately provide the essentials of life to their communities should centralized processes fail. This ends the first part of this presentation. Initially, this talk was intended to be a single presentation. However, given the importance and time dependence of the information within this talk, it was decided to release this talk in 2 parts, as it was taking considerable time to put together the remainder of the talk. In the second part of the talk, we will discuss why our current approaches do not typically succeed within the real world. For instance, why and how hospitals spread diseases when they are intended to cure people. And we will discuss how to change our approach to resolving real world challenges so that we can succeed sustainably and resolve our contemporary challenges. What can you do now? Many people feel disempowered. They don't believe that there is anything that can be done or that there is anything effective that can be done by them. However, there are things that we can all do, as we all currently directly contribute to the problems that we experience within the world today. And it is important to appreciate that we can succeed by taking appropriate action now. If you're interested, please review our website, blog, and forthcoming videos. Also, please consider supporting us through donations and funding, as it is important that we share the appropriate training and understanding of our problems and the solutions in order to be able to resolve our problems. Sapient thinking, helping everyone to intellectually see and understand the big picture, in order to appreciate and implement the shared, simple, and effective solutions to all of the seemingly unrelated real-world challenges that we face.